Good evening. Such a formal thing at this podium. My name is Greg Sharrow. I'm co-director of the Vermont Folklife Center on the traffic circle across the bridge. People will often say, you know, the Folk Song Society, what's that about? And in an attempt to really bring things down to the essence, my response is that our objective is to help people become visible to one another. Our research methodology, ethnographic field research, the objective of which is to understand an experience from the perspective of the person to whom it belongs, flowing then into programming that includes exhibitions, radio, I'm about to launch a podcast, and other forms of public outreach. This evening is in conjunction with an exhibit titled Portraits in Action, Pioneers in Renewable Energy, Environmental Conservation, and Land Use Planning, which includes 25 people who have taken an activist role in each of these arenas and devoted a goodly share of their time, energy, and capability to advancing these issues. This is the second program in the program series associated with this exhibit. There will be a third on the Smith Putnam project on Grandpa's Knob in the 1930s in Hubbardton, and Beth Sachs advises us on a program about women and energy. So tonight I want to begin by inviting our panelists to introduce themselves. Then I'll lay out the format for the conversation, and at any point we invite you to raise a question, to express a point of view, but there will also be time for a discussion afterward. In fact, we're envisioning the formal part of this to be compact, so that there is plenty of time for us to all talk together. Leigh Seddon, if you'd say a few words, and we'll work our way to David Blittersdorf, Tim Maker, and Beth Sachs, and then I'll pop up here again to lay out where we're headed.
Thank you, Greg. I'm Leigh Seddon. I live in Montpelier. I'm a transplant to Vermont in 1970. I was in engineering school and dropped out to come to Vermont because of the environmental things that were happening, like Act 250 and land use planning. But my real start in renewable energy occurred in about 1980. I left, I was an environmental lobbyist, and I realized in 1980 that I could be installing solar panels on roofs, saving people money, and doing far more for the environment than walking the halls of the legislature trying to get bills passed. So I started Solar Works in 1980. I spent 35 years in solar energy, doing projects around the world, from Yemen to South Africa to the United States, and have really developed my thinking about what is necessary to combat climate change and to actually make the energy future sustainable. And I'm a technologist. Ooh, thank you. Oh, that's very loud. It's perfect. Okay, it's just perfect. I'm an engineer and a technologist, but I realized many years ago that it's not technology that's going to save us. We have the technology to create a renewable energy economy. Every day, our world gets thousands of times more energy delivered from the sun to every place on the earth, available free of charge to every body on earth than we need. And the technology is there that we can actually power and create a renewable energy economy. What stands in the way of that is not necessarily cost, but it's our economic systems and how we are organized socially and how we think about things. So one of the most exciting things that I have done in the last few years is do a energy profile for how Vermont could get to 90% renewable by 2050. And I know we can do it through technology, wind, solar, but what's most exciting is the enormous savings that will come when we transition to a renewable economy. Electric vehicles are twice as cost effective as fossil fuel vehicles. Net zero homes can pay for themselves in as little as 7 years. So they're huge savings, and the question is how to unlock those savings and get everybody able to invest in those technologies and come out of the past fossil fuel era and really unleash the power for everybody in savings. So I'll talk more about that later on, but that's my vision as an engineer, is that technology is not a question of technology, and it's really not a question of being unaffordable. It is the only affordable path, but we have to revise our economic system somewhat to do that.
Well, this will be right. Yeah. Okay. I guess I'd rather stand up here. I think Leigh's a few years older than me, but I'm born and raised here in Vermont, born in Proctor, grew up in Pittsford, Vermont, just down the road. And I got my start really in renewables as a young boy. I was only 12 years old when, in 1969, my dad rented a snowmobile in the middle of winter. Now, this is 1969 when snowmobiles, you rent one and you could drive all day and only go about 20 miles. And this is older technology, but he rented a snowmobile and brought me to the top of Grandpa's Knob down in Hubbardton to show me the foundations of the first wind turbine that ever produced power into a grid. So it was a great experiment. And just by showing me the concrete foundations that were left, I became enthralled about wind energy. I was only 12 years old. And so I ended up dedicating my life to wind power. And this was 69, early 70s. We had this dream in the United States and the world that nuclear power was going to save us from all of our energy problems, too cheap to meter. And at the time, even as a teenager, I sensed something was wrong with this idea. And look at where we are today. Nuclear power is not the savior, it's a big problem. So that got me started thinking of where I was going to go. First, I wanted to be a meteorologist. I wanted to be a carpenter. And then I went to UVM and graduated with a mechanical engineering degree. And just a couple of years after Leigh formed his company, I formed NRG Systems in 1982 out of a house in Bristol, Vermont, in the spare bedroom and a porch, and grew a business, a worldwide business, that became the leader in wind measurement technology in the world. I've since left that business. My ex-wife now owns it, and the buildings are, and the business is still in Heinsberg. So in the last 10 years, I've switched to do solar trackers. So I'm an engineer by design, and I design products, and I like to market. So first I designed wind measuring equipment, and then now I'm designing and building solar equipment. But in the meantime, 4 years ago, I got involved with developing a wind farm, Georgia Mountain Community Wind, and it's north of Burlington. It supplies almost 10% of Burlington's electricity. So all my years of wind energy on measuring, I got to actually build a wind farm instead of just selling to all the companies that built the wind farms around the world. And it taught me, and it was actually quite fun. I could actually build a wind farm, be in the business, sell the power to Burlington, and these are great big toys for me. You know, as an engineer, you know, these are tremendous machines and modern technology that really, really work. They're very efficient compared to where we were 30 years ago. So we started out in the late 30s, early 40s, leading the world with the first experiment with the Grampus Mountain wind turbine. And now we have an energy plan and a goal that says we're going to go to 90% renewables. And right now, we're less than 80-some% fossil fuel based in our economy in Vermont. So we have a long ways to go. And back when I started in wind energy in 1982, we all thought back then it was just going to be a few years before wind and solar and everything took off. And it did for a little while, but then it crashed. And we basically blew about 30 years of time. And you're seeing the resurgence of solar and wind, the two technologies that are the main renewables going forward. And it's sad that we blew that amount of time, but here we are, and we're advancing the technologies. And I think later we'll talk about what those technologies are, where we're going to go, and how hard or easy I think it's going to be hard to get to our goals, because we as humans don't change very fast. And we have massive change on our doorsteps. And so we'll talk about that.
Good evening. I'm Tim Maker. I live in Calais. I grew up in Springfield, Vermont. And my career in energy started in 1980 when I was a member of the HEAT team, the Home Energy Audit Team. It was housed around the state in county extension offices, with one here in Addison County in Middlebury. And I worked in that program for 5 years, did hundreds and hundreds of home energy audits, and became very grounded in what efficiency really meant for houses. And the primary way that we looked at houses was through heat, how heat is lost, how heat is put into houses, and how you make that system better. But we also spent a lot of time thinking about helping homeowners figure out their electric use. And at that time, we were just beginning to pay attention to electricity as an issue. I went on and, as a member of a volunteer committee in my town, advised the school board about what to do with their electrically heated elementary school. And we went out, it was a group of 3 of us on this volunteer committee, we went out and did research, and we came up with this idea of heating with wood chips. And it turned out there was one other school in Vermont that did it. There were some other businesses, there were places around the Northeast that were doing this, but nobody really seriously. So we went and kind of put our ideas out to the school board, and they said, good idea, let's go for a bond vote. So in 1986, we got up for a town meeting in Calais, you know, town hall, voice vote kind of thing. We discussed it, there was discussion back and forth. And we had a vote on whether we were going to pass a bond vote to put a wood chip heating system in our school. And the vote was unanimous, yes. Now, in a Vermont town meeting, to have a unanimous vote on anything is kind of extraordinary. And the 3 of us who were the volunteers here said, something's going on. There's some kind of a good idea here. And as it turned out, each of the 3 of us went on to make that the cornerstone of our careers. So I had my own consulting business in the mid-80s and continued on working for that. And then after a while, around 2001, I was encouraged by the Public Service Department to start a nonprofit to kind of export the technology experience that we were gaining in large-scale wood energy systems to other parts of the country. The state itself couldn't do that, so we thought a nonprofit would be a good idea. It was Scudder Parker who really had the idea. And so we formed the Biomass Energy Resource Center. I was the executive director for 6 years, stayed another couple of years, and then I went back to working for myself as a consultant for large-scale systems, mostly working at the campus level. So the most recent part of my evolution in energy has been solar. As a member of our town energy committee, trying to figure out how to make residential solar work in a small rural town where, frankly, all of the conditions line up against it. It's almost impossible. It's really, really frustrating. And I won't go into that. But anyway, that's how some of the things I'm thinking about today.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Beth Sachs, and I don't know how far back to go. I'll go back a little ways. Actually, I got involved in this when, after the oil embargo in 1972-73, which is actually very different than what's going on now, because that was an issue of who controlled the oil. It was long before peak oil was an issue at all. It was there, it was just who was going to control whether we could, in this country, get it or not. And at about the same time, in the early 70s, I learned about climate change. I learned, and it scared the crap out of me. It was just, even today, but then 45 years ago or whatever, when I heard about it, I felt like I was on the edge of a cliff. And it was so disturbing to think about the fact that we were doing things then that were going to affect us 50 years in the future, and we wouldn't know. We're not used to having our actions be so far removed from the consequences, or vice versa. So anyway, I was scared, and it was very frightening, and I decided that energy efficiency and sustainability were where I wanted to go for the rest of my life, I guess. And at the same time, I was as interested in creating an organization that respected people and where people wanted to work, where we could really build a good model for how to be a business in the world. Those two things went together. And, excuse me, so when I first started thinking about this, after the oil embargo, we decided that, my partner and I, that we needed to do a lot of research on solar energy, mostly passive solar. And then years and years and years of that, we both sort of woke up at the same time and said, you know what, technology's all here. It's really not about the technology. It's about what are the barriers that are keeping people from implementing it. So we thought about it a lot, and I called 100 people around the state who had had heat audits and said, what have you done? And mostly they said, you know, not much, aerators. So we thought, what are the barriers that are really keeping people from doing this? And there were three. There was lack of access to good information, there was lack of access to capital, and it was just a hassle. And it's kind of embarrassing 30 years later to say the same three. I think those are pretty much the same three barriers. I think we've made progress on some of them, more than others. But it was so logical to me that, and I use my mother as an example. She lived in a row house in Baltimore, where I grew up. And in row houses are tall and skinny, so it was always really cold on the first floor and really hot on the top floor, year round. And we were trying to help her figure out what to do, and there was nobody that she could call to help her figure out what to do. It was everyone that she could call was a heating and ventilating and air conditioning contractor, and they all had something to sell her. So we thought, we need to create an entity that has no vested interest in what the decision, what the end result is of helping people, other than it's best for them. And so, with that in mind, we started Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, two of us in 1986, and now we're at 340 people, and we operate Efficiency Vermont, which probably most of you hopefully have heard of. So that's all for now, thanks.
Now, this is just a tiny bit of a non sequitur, but I forgot to say before that this discussion is being held at the Unitarian Universalist Society space, and it is being co-sponsored by the Universalist, Unitarian Universalist Society as well. And this building, the sanctuary building, is a green building. And in fact, you can learn a great deal more about it from a flyer where flyers live out in the entry area. I was afraid I'd forget that if I didn't say it now. So we have this exhibit. I appealed to the 25, 26 people who are, and each of these folks is in fact a part of the exhibit. I appealed to each saying, if you have any ideas for programmatic activity in conjunction with the exhibit, let me know. And Tim Maker said, yeah, I think it'd be good to have a panel discussion about, you know, what's this transition really going to look like? You know, we talk a lot about it, but a panel discussion where you really get down to brass tacks. And I asked him if he would, if he could think of people that would be likely to have something to say in the context of this kind of discussion. And he suggested our worthy panelists this evening. And he also quite kindly wrote text that I could use then to not only promote the session, but also to let everybody else know what Tim had in mind. And I'm just going to read briefly from this. While it's possible to identify the kinds of energy technologies and systems that will take us where we need to go, it's much harder to envision how this will actually play out. What level of efficiency do we need to achieve, and how much renewable energy do we need? Will society at large be able to afford this technological change? Will economically disadvantaged people be left behind? Can we do it fast enough? Will only wealthy nations have the resources to change quickly? Are our political institutions up to the task? So that's the sort of the ground here for what will flow forward now. And to get us rolling, I'm going to turn to Tim.
Thank you. Let me see if I turn it up. I turn it.
And I turn it back to you.
How's that? Nothing.
Press mute now.
Turn the other one.
There's something there. There's something tested.
Hello? Hello?
Turn the other one. That's right there.
Doing anything? Yes.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. When Greg asked me to think about this, he sent an email out, and as it turned out, I was in Nepal for 2 months when I got this email. And I was there working as a volunteer for a nonprofit that was building schools in the district that was the epicenter of the earthquake a year ago, April. And so as I was thinking about this, I knew what all this felt like in the Vermont context, in the national context. But when I looked around me, the context was very different. We're talking about goals of reducing our reliance on fossil fuels by 90% within a few decades. And yet, the people who I was seeing around me were moving as quickly as they could to become more and more dependent on diesel and fossil fuels. That was their path toward development. These are very poor people. They didn't own cars. And their only way of transportation really was decrepit buses. They were in a place where there were buses, or walking. And that was the kind of world that they lived in. And so the more buses, the more trucks spewing diesel exhaust, the better, because that was, in a way, a pathway to a better life. So from that perspective, I sort of scratch my head and say, so how does this energy transition really work here in this environment is so different from what we experience every day. And so that was kind of a foundational thing for me. How does this really work? And the other experience that I've had in recent years that sort of raises the same bar as a naive Vermonter was when I was working on the development of a project in Queens and would fly down to New York City once in a while, either into LaGuardia or JFK. And looking out of the airplane on the way down, you look out, in my whole history, in my profession, just about keeping buildings, really. And I looked out and I'd say, oh my God, how bad are we going to do that? You know, because look at these tall project buildings, just all kinds of buildings, and we're going to do that with air source heat pumps, or how are we going to get off fossil fuel? It just seemed like an impossible thing. And I don't have the answer to that question. None of us have the answer. We have, concepts about what it might look like. But those are the kind of questions that I found myself asking that go beyond, we can do it with solar, we can do it with wind. Somehow those seem like technological directions toward where we're going to go, but how are we really going to get there? So I guess I would pose that question for other people and their thoughts.
Well, it's a great question of what's going to happen globally, because we can become 100% renewable in Vermont, and it won't affect much other than be a small beacon of light for the rest of the world that you can do it. My experience, I've worked overseas many years. When President Reagan came in and closed down the solar industry, I was forced to support our business by going overseas. So I spent 3 years developing the solar program for South Africa after apartheid, after Nelson Mandela was released. And it was fascinating to me because what I saw there was that the country was bankrupt. They were not, the only place there was electricity were the major cities. You would go about half a mile outside of the city, the power lines stopped. So 95% of the country was without electricity. And how were you going to bring electricity to that population? They weren't going to run wires. They couldn't afford them. They were bankrupt. Solar was the only affordable power source that we could get out into the villages. So for 3 years, we developed a model of getting solar into villages through nonprofits that were trusted, the agricultural nonprofits that worked in the villages, and with the goal of having 10,000 village systems a year put out. And what was amazing was at first there was real resistance from Eskom, the utility that operates in South Africa, but they realized that this was the least cost way and the only way and the only political solution. And so they put their money behind that. And so this has happened once people's eyes are opened and you stop people like USAID supporting diesel water pumping and things like that. They realize it's the least cost solution. And the other hopeful thing that I saw was what happened with cell phones. Who would imagine that cell phones would become the ubiquitous means of communication for subsistence farmers in India to Wall Street bankers in 7 years? It's the fastest technological change that's ever happened on our globe, and it's enabled microfinance banking. Farmers, subsistence farmers cannot work without cell phones now because cell phones connect them to the market, which they never had. It's that connectivity. And so that was amazing. It's amazing what's going to happen in the future with cell phones and microfinance. So now in African countries, other countries, you can take out a loan on your cell phone in about 5 minutes to get what you need. Much easier than getting a loan in the United States. So that same thing can happen with solar energy, wind energy, if we allow it to be built into our communities and have the systems that can support it and allow it to pay back over 20 or 30 years. The other thing in our economy is that we're focused on the next quarterly profits. We're focused on, is the payback less than a year? You know, that's really ridiculous. Our buildings last hundreds of years. We hopefully live for 70 years, and all we're concerned about is the next quarter. So what's revolutionized solar in Vermont is long-term contracts. The state now allows 25-year contracts for solar. That's all that's necessary to allow community solar plants to be built, is that long-term financing, and banks are catching on. So I'll stop there, but those are a few of the hopeful things I've seen.
Well, Leigh talked about the hopeful side. I'm going to get a little pessimistic, even though I'm an optimist at heart, because some of the questions here are, how are we going to restructure our energy system away from fossil fuels when we've spent the last 2 centuries building a fossil fuel-based economy? And the way I like to think of the fossil fuels that we have been using is we won the fossil fuel lottery. What we won was this amazing amount of energy that we're going to go through, basically all of it between 1900 and 2100. We have a 200-year blip in the history of humans. And this is a one-time deal. It's like winning a lottery. And we all know what lottery winners do. They go bankrupt. And we're doing the same thing. So we're at the peak of fossil fuel use. And like anyone that won the lottery and they're at the peak of their spending, it's party time, and that's what we see. And so when we look out, we look at our cars, we look at all these things. This is not real going forward. This is, you know, I look at some of you young people in the audience. I tell my son, he's 28 years old, if you want to see the world, if you want to do these things, get on that jet plane, because in the future, you're not going to do that. We are using all this energy in a very short amount of time. And so something has to change. And we can voluntarily do these changes, or the physical world will change for us. And that's coming. Oil in the world, conventional, non-conventional, fracked oil, we're peaking right now, even though our government in the United States says we got oil for 100 years. We're the new Saudi Arabia of oil. It is absolutely wrong. We're being lied to. So this is the real life. I'm an engineer. I study the physical world. I have to live in the physical world when we design products. And the world is not the way you see it by just looking out the door. That is the present world, but a few years from now, it's totally different. So the question is, can we do this fast enough? I don't think so. We're going to be forced to use a lot less energy. So we're going to have to do efficiency, conservation, but the energy intensity that we all live with, especially here in the United States, we're the guiltiest people in the whole world. We're less than 5% of the world's population, but we consume 25% of the energy, 25% of all resources. So we're going to be affected the worst. And here in Vermont, we have a chance to actually convert to renewable energy. And this is all energy, and we're going to probably have to electrify everything we can. So it's all going to be electric technologies, wind and solar electric technologies. We're going to be getting off of liquid fuels, but we have very little time to do it. But it needs leadership. And the question, are our political institutions up for the task? No. We have to do it ourselves. So we have to drive it from underneath. And that's why you're here today. We have to drive it from our side in our communities. We have to relocalize our communities. We have to get density. We have to get mass transit. And I got in trouble a year ago when I was recorded that we have to kill the car. The automobile is what's causing this huge use of energy between driving the car, building the car, the highway system. You look at all the embedded fossil fuels in our system. It's huge. So we have to get out of the car. So how do you do that? It scares people to death. So I want to drive my car. There's even a Facebook group called Don't Blittersdorf, Vermont. There's over 400 members, and it's because I said we have to get out of the car and change to something different. So that's coming.
Well, Dave and I always either agree or totally disagree. And I agree with him that, peak oils happened where we are basically, as Kim wrote, we have to keep all the fossil fuels that are in the ground for us to survive. And really, the big goal in the end is to hold on to the planet's ability to sustain life. It's nothing less than that. I think I agree that we need to electrify pretty much everything. And, that goes hand in hand. So that's solar and wind and biomass. And the less of that we have to produce, the better, which is why energy efficiency is the first answer to everything. In my opinion, because that's the only way we're going to need less of it. I guess where I differ is that I think I agree we don't have time to wait around, but I think if we don't have political will to do it, we won't survive. I think that we don't have time to convince everybody that they should change their light bulbs or buy air source heat pumps or hybrid cars. There's just not time to do that. So I think codes and standards and laws are the only way that we're going to get there soon enough. And if there's a grassroots movement that supports that, that's going to help a lot. But without that kind of intervention, I just don't think it's going to happen. And the concern I have is until we get to that point, if we don't manage this transition in an orderly way, there will be no justice. The poorest people will be hurt the first. And those of us who can afford to move higher up the mountains will move higher up the mountains. And so that's why it has to be done from a political, thoughtful, looking at the whole society's needs and do it in an orderly, rational way, or it's just not going to be fair.
I want to agree with you 100%. I think that while we need to be really careful about what we're doing and change our lifestyle, we have to also pay attention to what we're doing as we do it. I am really concerned, upset about the fact that to put wind towers on top of mountaintops, we're destroying all kinds of habitat. We are destroying the mountaintops. We'll never get them back. And I think if we're going to talk about saving the planet, we shouldn't go destroy it to save it. And no one is taking the time in this mad rush of doing something, including, I think, a lot of people making a lot of money off of it, to really look at everything that it all involves. And I am so fed up with listening to everybody talk about how this is so great and that is so great, and nobody will really look at what it's actually doing. Thank you for mentioning those that are not as able to take care of themselves. Thank you for mentioning the animals, for everybody that can't take care of themselves, and how we are, to me, destroying them without giving any kind of thought, and then go off and become wonderful, well-known, honored people. It just, I'm sorry, but it really ticks me off.
Well, one of the ways that I describe that is, have anyone heard the concept of yo-yo versus weight? I love it. You're on your own, or we're in this together. And it just really says a lot to me about how we're going to get there. Is it's not going to be people making individual decisions and individual solutions. I work at the EIC, which operates Efficiency Vermont, and we have, I guess I could say it, I could, there are so many things that we could do so much better. I mean, it's doing great things, but the fact that we provide incentives to energy efficient 5,000 square foot houses rather than encouraging 600 square foot houses in some ways just doesn't make sense to me. And I think we have to think about some solutions like that. I have another one, which I think would make a huge impact right away and would cost nothing, which is to just change the speed limit to 55. People would freak out everywhere, and it would save an enormous amount of money. It has to be done at the federal level because the federal government decides who gets what highway money, and that's what happens.
I'd just like to follow up a little bit, because it seems to me that you mentioned that, you know, we need political will, and that's more important. But the reality is, governments and businesses do what the people want them to do. They provide for those people. So until the people want something different and are willing to change, we're not going to get, in my view, a lot of change in business. So we need both. It's not the government or business, it's not the individuals. Both have to actually happen. And actually, the individuals are going to drive the businesses and the government by making changes through education. And unfortunately, it looks like it's going to be when things are so bad that people have no choice, then it's going to happen. That's unfortunately, we see that we're waiting for that crisis.
I agree. We can't. It's not either or.
So when you say 55, unless we're all willing to drive 55 and everyone's doing 65, it's not going to happen. Just an example.
I'd like to speak a little bit as a contrarian on the idea that what we need to do is move to 100% electrification, which is the area that I differ with David on, respectfully. I think that really all of the above strategy is, if you want to call it a strategy or a path forward, is the important thing. It isn't as clean and simple as that. One of the things that my years as an energy auditor taught me, and this was, you know, talking to people in their homes, all kinds of people. Many of them, people of very limited means. And I could see then, and I see today, that when push comes to shove in terms of energy price, people bring out the wood stove. That's something that happens, particularly here in Vermont. It's anarchic. You know, it's not something that is a matter of public policy, but it's something that happens because it's a matter of economic survival for a lot of people. So when I look at the world, I don't, particularly the Vermont world and the developing world, I don't see that there are pat answers. And that a lot of what I think is really going to happen is going to be economic pressure in people's lives forces them to do certain things. They may not choose to conserve. They may be forced to conserve because they have no choice. That's all they can afford to do is to use less. It sounds like conservation is a very noble idea, but a lot of people do it just because they have to.
I just want to respond to Beth's comment about codes and standards and government control, which are all necessary, but I am a big believer in free market forces. And in this country, we've never had a free market, but the things that a free market needs to operate are information, good information, access to capital for everybody, and correct prices that reflect what the true social cost is of something. And when those come into alignment, the market forces can change the world and go faster than anything else. And there are a few examples. One small example in Vermont is air source heat pumps. Air source heat pumps have been around a long time. They've gotten more efficient. But until people actually knew about them, heard about them from a trusted source, and was able to finance them, there was no market uptake. Now, cold weather air source heat pumps are taking off, and when GMP did their first pilot in Rutland, they were oversubscribed and basically sold out in 24 hours because all of the right ingredients were there: a lease payment, information, and immediate savings on the bill. So when we can unleash the market in the correct way, with those and not have a controlled market. An example of a controlled market is when Vermont Yankee was built. That was built through government regulation and other political dealings. We can have really rapid change. And so I think it's unrealistic to think that codes and standards and government control will do anything except make people real angry. But if you have some government controls on the worst things, the codes that support just not being able to build a home that leaks most of its energy out the windows, have a substandard, let the market lead to the top end. And the most disadvantaged people in the world, the poorest people, are the ones who are hurt most by our current system. Our current fossil fuel system really is very costly and imposes incredible hardship on poor people. And if you think about the extraction of fossil fuels and the poor communities there, it just goes on and on. And so one of the best things we can do for social equity is drive towards renewables. And there are issues there to be addressed, but the existing fossil fuel economy is the most oppressive worldwide. And in America, we control some of that oppression. In other countries, that oppression is a life and death matter.
I just a response to you. As you said, there's no free market in the United States. Why would we expect there in the future with the subsidies could be mostly going to fossil fuels? You've all talked about basically more renewables and trying to reduce fossil fuels. It seems like the first step in reducing fossil fuels is to stop building new fossil fuel infrastructure. And yet the economy is totally, and all the money in the market is not supporting that at all. That's right. There. Can you talk to that? How can we get to that point?
Well, my view is that the role of federal or state government is to make the market work and not to rig the market or do other things. So a lot of my work in Vermont has been to convince state government that the market is not working for certain things like efficiency or renewables, and that they could do certain tweaks to make it more transparent, to get the pricing correct. That's what we've done on solar, is get the pricing correct. And that leads to a market that serves everybody, is equitable, and has changed. But you're absolutely right. Vermont's sort of unique, but nationally, our market is really controlled and messed up. But it should be, my view is, it should be the role of government to allow an equitable free market to work.
I want to address what both of these folks, Beth and Leigh, have been talking about, going back to the political institutions we have and what we're trying to do in Vermont. I agree, Beth, that we have to have leadership at the top level to move this. And what we're all facing is it's really kind of dismal that we don't have the leadership. And, Bernie Sanders is out there on a national level pushing for that leadership, and look what's happening. You can see the status quo, the business as usual forces at work. So we're trying to do something different in Vermont. But politicians only get elected by 51% of the people. So they have to go and say, they don't always tell you the truth of where you're going, where you have to go. And, the reality is, in Vermont, we import almost 90% of our energy. And we also import almost 90% of our food. So we think we're this independent state. I like to think of myself as very self-sufficient, independent, but we're not. It is like going to Disney World, and 90% of what you see in Disney World comes through the back door every day. That's what we have. And to get to 90% in the state, it means we're going to have massive change. the woman in the back talked about siting of wind turbines. Really, the amount of land in what these wind turbines do for their impact on our environment is very small. If you look at Vermont and you want to look at what we've done by fragmenting forests and developing in the rural countryside, all you have to do is look at Act 250 and the 10-acre loophole. Act 250 developed more back land in rural areas than wind will ever do. And when Act 250 did this, people moved into the country. They moved on long dirt roads. They're farther away from the substations and the power lines. So that's why we have rural co-op services way out in the middle of nowhere. But that's what people wanted. They wanted to move away from the cities. But this is all coming back. We are going to have to move back to towns, and we have to relocalize and densify so that we aren't living in the middle of nowhere, traveling all over the place. And that comes to the car and the transportation system. It's a huge amount of energy, and it's going to change. We're going to have trains, we're going to have buses, we're going to have people living close to where they were in vibrant cities like Montpelier being redeveloped. So there's where the new change comes. But it's going to cost a lot of money to do this change.
There's at least, you had your hand up in the second row first, and then you back there.
I'll defer to someone else at this point.
Okay.
Well, thank you for the dialogue. I find it very impressive. I don't agree with everything. That's understandable. I agree with Mr. Blittersdorf on the car. I don't agree with you on Rich and I'll explain reasons why. But I happen to be lucky to be part of the first American delegation to the People's Republic of China shortly after President Carter normalized relations. And I'm restoring the photos I took while I was there. And I took one from the 11th floor of the Beijing Hotel, looking down at Tiananmen Square, looking at the same crosswalk where the man stood 10 years later in front of the tanks. It's a panoramic photo, and I could count on one hand the number of cars. There were slightly more buses and an enormous number of bicycles. This is in 79. In 72, when Nixon went, some of the people on my group had been with Nixon, and they said the change in those 7 years was incredible. And I'm afraid to go back to Beijing today. And so I agree with the tyranny of the automobile. One of the things I observed about the exhibition over here at Vermont Folklife, and I really like Vermont Folklife Center and the people at it, is it exemplifies, though, what I call a changed discourse about the environment here in Vermont. I came up in '65. I do a lot of environmental history. I'm doing a lot now in the early days of leading up to Act 250. Here's what Dean Davis said in 1970 in his speech to the legislature. He made a speech on environmental control in January of 1970. He said, humans are indeed an inescapable part of an intricate system of life and growth that begins with air, soil, and water, and includes myriad forms of life and activity upon which we are mutually dependent. He sounded like John Muir. And he, in the space of a month, in May of '69, spent 3 days in Windham County looking at the threats posed in Dover and Wilmington by rampant land use development. In 2013, the people of Windham and Grafton had to corner Governor Champlain at the Grafton Inn when he went there with his staff for a retreat. And here's what they reported Governor Champlain saying: birds, bats, and bears are expendable in the effort to keep the planet safe. To me, this exemplifies this kind of upside down thinking about the environment. We're destroying land in order to save land. And I disagree with you on wind, because while it might not be many acres, it's at the most sensitive peak of our mountains. And I'm sort of, I love the irony of the fact that the exhibit's dedicated to Shirley Strong, who most people don't know, because she died in 2005. She was a fierce defender of Vermont's mountains. Her gravestone has a bas relief of the mountains and the long trail sign. It says defenders of mountains and their trails. She and Huck Vogelman and Bob Spear, who started the Green Mountain Audubon Society, set up the Green Mountain Profile Committee to preserve the ridge lines. And to see them so cavalierly destroyed today, I find objectionable or repugnant. So I like the dialogue. Mr. Blittersdorf, I agree with you on some of the things, and I disagree with you on something fundamental. Thank you.
Thank you. There, no, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I'd like to get back to how we're going to get there. If you drive down the East Coast, take 95 down, you just see the vast amount of energy used every second. It's unbelievable. And how is that going to be converted? We might be able to do it here in Vermont, possibly. But how are we going to do it there? And 51% of the people who are electing our politicians want their cars, and they want their air conditioning, and they want their goodies. They want their stuff from China and whatever. But getting back to the practicality here in Vermont, we have a comprehensive energy plan that calls for 90% renewable by 2050, and I think there was a bill in the legislature this year that called for 90% by 2035 or something like that. And I just don't see how we're going to do that. I'm all for solar and wind, but until there's some way to store energy for when those aren't working, when the sun's not shining, how are we going to get there? And I'd like some information, some speculation on the actual technology, more so than the political side of it.
You want to talk about storage? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll talk about the storage and this whole issue of intermittency of wind and solar. The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. Fossil fuels gave us this great gift that we could dig this stuff out of the ground and burn it at will, and we could control it. So the past has been driven by this idea that we have throttles on our energy systems, and liquid fuels, oil, is easy to store. The future without these fossil fuels is going to be different. The issue of how we integrate wind, solar, hydro, biomass, what we're going to probably have is an integrated electrical system. And that means when you integrate all these different sources, you can actually do it without much storage. And the Europeans have already figured this out. Denmark at times is over 100% wind power on some nights. But what do? They sell the excess power to Norway. Norway and Sweden shut down their hydro dams to act as big batteries. And so if you have an electrical system that's reliable, robust, and built like our interstate highway system, and I'm telling you right now, the United States does not have an electrical system that's good enough for the future. It has to be integrated like Eisenhower built the highway system across the US. Right now, we have all these different control areas in the United States in our electrical system. It has to change. Our grid was designed over 100 years ago. And how it was designed and how it operates is almost identical to the era of Westinghouse and Edison. So things have to change, and we have to have a smart grid that can use all these things. But we know how to do it. It's just, you have to invest in this. We have to have DC power lines. We have to have things move around, and then this can work. But until that happens, we're going to be battling, oh, we have to store all this stuff, or we have to do localized things. But the future is different. But we're going to have to invest some money to do that.
To follow up on Dave's ideas about our electrical system, I agree that we can go to wind and solar intermittent resources with very little storage. One of the main things that we don't have in our grid right now is communication. So for 5 cents, you can put a chip in a refrigerator and it can respond to a signal from the utilities saying, I'd love you to shut off for the next 30 seconds to avoid this blip. So once we are interconnected with fast broadband, the communication can actually take out a lot of the ups and downs and momentary surges. The other thing I think we're lucky in Vermont to have is our neighbor Hydro-Quebec. Hydro-Quebec is a 98% renewable energy system that has great storage capacity and firm power. Vermont's load is minuscule compared to what Hydro-Quebec can supply. Now, I was one who fought the second round of James Bay Dam building and fought at the Public Service Board with the Cree to stop that project because it was so environmentally destructive. Those projects are built now, they're operating, and even though I oppose those projects at this point, it is clean power, it is available for us, and just having a small segment of Hydro-Quebec power in 2050 would allow us to do reliably all of our storage. So communication, renewables, and electric vehicles, electric transport. The transport sector is the hardest one to change, and there'll be a few biofuels, some of our heavy equipment, heavy transport may use biofuels, but biofuels are not well developed and won't be for at least another 20 years. So electrification of our light duty fleet and our heavy fleet is really the way to go, and we can power them with renewables.
There's been a little discussion of the comprehensive energy plan. One of the commenters suggested that he didn't understand how we could reach that goal. The CEP, if anyone spent any time with it, actually addresses the physics and of how this can be done. It seems to me quite rationally. I wonder if anyone on the panel would care to comment on the real feasibility, politics notwithstanding, of the CEP, the current CEP.
Well, I will just volunteer that I think it is a pathway to the future, and the latest CEP has milestones that we can meet. And what I did in 2013, and this is through the Energy Action Network, is a pathways report of what are the technological pathways that are least cost to get us to 90% renewable by 2015. It's a technical document that just talks about solar, wind, biomass, and efficiency. And but it's quite easy when you add those things up to see an energy future that